The Boston Massacre, 5 Colonists Killed by British Soldiers, by Alison Stark Draper. American colonists struggle under British rule. In the early 1600s, British settlers sailed from England to America. Some of these settlers landed in Massachusetts. They founded a town called Boston. In the 1700s, the settlers were ruled by King George III of England. They paid British taxes and obeyed British laws. As time passed, the British settlers stopped thinking of themselves as British citizens. They started to think of themselves as American colonists. By the late 1700s, many Americans were angry that they were still ruled by the British. On March 5, 1770, a fight broke out at the Custom House in Boston. 5 American colonists were shot and killed by British soldiers. The Americans named this event the Boston Massacre. American boy shot in anti-British demonstration. The British knew that most Americans did not want to follow British laws. They sent soldiers to Boston to scare the Americans. British soldiers armed with guns stood guard all over Boston. This made the American colonists even angrier. They did not like being treated as enemies. One morning, in February 1770, a crowd of angry Americans surrounded the house of a man named Ebenezer Richardson, who sided with the British. They threw rocks at his windows. A rock shattered the glass and hit his wife. Mr. Richardson fired his musket into the crowd. He killed an 11-year-old boy named Christopher Snyder. Hundreds of Americans attended the boy's funeral. Many blamed the British for his death. The British soldier fights with American rope maker. On March 2, 1770, a British soldier went to a rope yard to ask for work. William Green, one of the rope makers, said the soldier could clean his outdoor bathroom. The British soldier was insulted. The 2 men fought, and the soldier lost. He left, but returned with several soldiers and started the fight again. William Green and the other rope makers won. The British soldiers left, then returned with even more men. The owner of the rope yard came out and stopped the fight. He told the British soldiers to go home. The soldiers were still angry. Later on, an American overheard a British soldier's wife say that soon the soldiers would, quote, "wep their bayonets in New England's people's blood." American colonists attack British guard. On March 5, 1770, a British soldier named Hugh White stood guard on King Street. Hugh White was a private in the British Army. He was guarding the street alone. Several American boys gathered to make fun of him. More American colonists arrived. Soon, a crowd of 50 people were yelling at Private White. Private White did not want any trouble. He tried to stand still and ignore them. Then a teenage boy named Edward Garrick touched Private White's uniform. Private White lifted his musket and hit the boy in the face. The crowd of Americans screamed. They threw rocks and ice at Private White. They told him they would kill him. Someone rang a fire alarm bell, and more Americans came. Private White yelled for help. American mob faces Captain Preston and soldiers. 2 British soldiers heard Private White yell for help. The soldiers ran to the British guard station at the end of the street. The officer in charge was Captain Thomas Preston. Captain Preston and 8 soldiers marched out to help Private White. Captain Preston ordered his soldiers to carry their muskets, but not to fire them. The soldiers stayed close together. They used their sharp bayonets to push through the crowd. The Americans threw snowballs at Preston and his men. The soldiers were surrounded. The crowd grew larger. The Americans yelled insults at the soldiers. They called them lobsters because of their red coats. British-American shootout at Custom House. Captain Preston stood in front of his men to keep them from firing. He told the Americans to go home. One of the Americans threw a huge stick at the soldiers. It hit a British soldier in the face and knocked him down. The British soldier got to his feet. He lifted his musket and fired into the crowd. Everyone froze. Then the Americans rushed forward to attack the British soldiers. 3 or 4 British soldiers fired their guns. The Americans fought back with sticks and rocks. The British soldiers kept firing. They shot a total of 11 men. One of the men the soldiers shot was an American merchant named Edward Payne. Another was an American sailor named Crispus Attucks. 11 Americans shot by British soldiers. On the night of March 5, 1770, Captain Preston's British soldiers fired 10 or 12 shots at the mob of American colonists. They killed 3 Americans on the spot. 2 Americans were fatally injured and died shortly afterward. 6 Americans were wounded. After the shooting, the Americans gathered up the dead and wounded men and carried them back to their families. They sent for doctors and spread the news of the massacre. Captain Preston marched his soldiers home to their barracks. At 2 a.m. on March 6th, the town sheriff arrested Captain Preston. He charged Preston and 8 of his men with murder. If they were found guilty, they would be put to death. American lawyer John Adams defends British soldiers. The Boston Massacre was a confusing event. Some Americans believed that the British soldiers were murderers. Others, like future President John Adams, were worried the massacre would lead to more violence. John Adams was a lawyer and an American patriot before he was elected president. He believed in justice for all people. In the case of the Boston Massacre, he believed that the British soldiers had fired in self-defense. He thought that the soldiers had the right to protect themselves from an angry mob, even if that mob had a right to be angry at the British. John Adams decided to defend Captain Preston and his soldiers at their trial. British soldiers found not guilty of Boston Massacre. The trial of the British soldiers started on October 24, 1770. Many people testified. Everyone remembered the night differently. One American said there were only 70 Americans in the street. He said they were angry, but not dangerous. He said Preston's soldiers attacked them with bayonets. Captain Preston said there were 400 Americans on King Street that night. He said that they threatened to murder the British soldier on guard. John Adams proved that the soldiers fired to save their own lives. On October 31st, 1770, Captain Preston was found not guilty and released from jail. All the British soldiers were found not guilty of murder. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. Colonists make first move toward independence. The Boston Massacre was an important step toward the American Revolution and the creation of the United States of America. It convinced many Americans that they should not be ruled by the British. An American patriot named Paul Revere made an engraving of the Boston Massacre. The engraving shows a row of British soldiers firing on unarmed Americans. People who had not been at the massacre were horrified by the picture. It made them think differently about the British. Some became determined to drive the British out of America forever.